What you're looking at used to be the second floor. Not the basement, not the sub-level, the second floor of buildings that were, at the time of construction, designed to have their main entrances where their windows now sit. At street level, facing the public, open for business. The street you see in that photograph is not the original street. It is a deck, a platform built over the top of a city that was already there, with its storefronts, its sidewalks, its utility connections, its residents, sealed underneath. The year was 1889. Seattle had been incorporated as a city for just over a decade. It sat on tide flats and timber-logged hillsides above Puget Sound, with streets that had been graded without coordination, across a landscape that drained nowhere reliably. On June the 6th of that year, a cabinet-maker's pot of hide glue boiled over in a shop on First Avenue and Madison Street. The fire that followed destroyed 25 city blocks in under 12 hours, roughly 1 million square feet of commercial Seattle, gone before nightfall. The city rebuilt. That part is well documented. What is less documented, what the engineering journals celebrated without fully explaining to the people who lived there, is how it rebuilt. The decision was made by the city's engineers and by the property owners with the most to gain from the reconstruction to raise the street grade, not by inches, by 1 to 2 full stories, above where the original streets had run. The buildings that went up after the fire were constructed to meet the new grade. The buildings that had survived the fire, the ones on the edges of the burn zone, the ones that had simply been close enough to watch but far enough to stand, were not rebuilt. They were buried. Here is what the regrading actually looked like from the inside. The original streets of downtown Seattle had been laid at tide flat level, close enough to Puget Sound that high tide regularly pushed salt water into the lower blocks. The sewage system, such as it existed, ran on gravity toward the waterfront. At high tide, the gravity reversed. The pipes backed up. The streets flooded. The problem was not subtle, and it was not new. It had existed since the first permanent buildings went up in the 1870s. The 1889 fire did not create the drainage problem. It created the political window to solve it. The solution the city engineer Reginald Thompson proposed was the same logic Chicago had applied 30 years earlier. Raise the grade, build the sewers into the new elevation, let the old level drain below. But Seattle's version had a specific complication that Chicago's had not. The fire had destroyed the central commercial district almost completely, which meant the reconstruction could happen fast, and at the new grade, without the decade-long negotiation that Chicago had required block by block. The new buildings went up at the raised level. Their ground floors faced the new street. Their entrances, their storefronts, their windows, all calibrated to the grade that the engineers had specified for the post-fire city. But the raising of the streets did not happen simultaneously with the raising of the buildings. This is the detail that the celebratory accounts of Seattle's reconstruction consistently understate. The new buildings were constructed first. The street regrading, the actual physical work of filling, grading, and paving the new street surface, followed years. Later, block by block, on a timeline that was driven by funding availability and municipal politics rather than by any coordinated engineering plan. Which means that for a period of several years after the fire, years during which Seattle was actively rebuilding, actively growing, actively receiving new residents and new commerce, the new buildings stood at their finished grade, while the streets outside their front doors sat 1 to 2 stories below, and the sidewalks of that period were wooden walkways built at the level of the new building entrances, suspended above the original street grade on timber framing. Walking down a Seattle block in the early 1890s meant walking on a platform that had open drops on either side, where the old street level fell away and the new grade had not yet been filled in. Contemporary accounts describe pedestrians falling through gaps in the planking. A city ordinance from 1893 references injuries sustained from falls into what the municipal record calls the pointe, lower corridor. That phrase, lower corridor, is the first place in the official record where what would eventually become Seattle's underground appears as a named category of urban space. And here is where the bridge of relevance matters, because the experience of living in a city whose infrastructure decisions were made above your head, on a timeline you had no input into, with consequences that fell, literally, on the people at street level, is not a condition that requires a history degree to recognize. The people walking on those suspended sidewalks in 1893 did not choose the new grade. They did not vote on the Reconstruction timeline. They absorbed the consequences of decisions made by engineers, property owners, and municipal committees whose primary frame of reference was the city's commercial future, not the pedestrians' immediate safety. Maybe the suspended sidewalks were simply a transitional inconvenience, a temporary condition that resolved itself as the regrading progressed block by block, exactly as the city's plans described. If this were the whole picture, the story would be an interesting footnote in urban engineering history and nothing more. But the timeline refuses to stay simple. When the street regrading was finally completed in the central commercial blocks, when the new grade was filled, paved, and open, the space that remained between the new street surface and the old building foundations did not disappear. It became something else. The original ground floors of the post-fire buildings, the entrances that had faced the suspended sidewalks, the storefronts that had operated at the new building grade while the street below caught up, were now below the street. 1 story below, sometimes 2. In 1907, the city formally closes the underground sidewalk corridors to public use, citing sanitation concerns. By 1910, utility connections, gas lines, water mains, electrical conduit, are routed through the sealed lower level. And by 1914, fire insurance maps begin marking the substreet level as occupied space. Not storage, not mechanical. Occupied. The lower corridors had not been sealed. They had been repurposed. The Sanborn fire insurance maps are where the record becomes precise. The Sanborn Map Company produced detailed block-by-block surveys of American cities for fire underwriting purposes, documenting construction materials, building footprints, occupancy types, and utility connections with a specificity that municipal records of the period rarely matched. For Seattle, Sanborn produced editions in 1893, 1905, and 1912. The progression across those 3 editions tells a story that the city's official accounts of its own reconstruction do not. The 1893 edition shows the post-fire buildings at their new grade. It shows the street level as projected, the grade the engineers had specified, not yet fully achieved. It shows, in the notations that Sanborn cartographers used to indicate subgrade space, a category of occupancy that the map labels with the standard symbol for ground floor commercial use, applied below the street line. The 1905 edition shows the same blocks, with the regrading complete. The streets are filled, paved, finished. And the subgrade level, the original ground floors, now 1 to 2 stories below the new street surface, is still marked, still occupied. The notation does not change to storage. It does not change to mechanical. It remains, in the Sanborn Cartographic Convention, active commercial space. Historians note that the Sanborn maps for this period document a functioning sub-street commercial corridor running beneath several blocks of the central business district, beneath Post Alley, beneath portions of First Avenue, beneath the blocks immediately adjacent to the original burn zone, where the post-fire reconstruction had proceeded fastest, and where the grade differential was most pronounced. And here is where the record gets strange. The city's own public health records from the same period tell a different story about the underground than the Sanborn maps do. The 1907 ordinance that formally closed the lower corridors to public use, the document that the city's official history of the underground typically cites as the moment the sub-street level was sealed, describes the lower level in terms of sanitation risk, inadequate ventilation, and the accumulation of refuse. It is the language of a space being shut down. But the Sanborn edition of 1912, 5 years after the ordinance that supposedly closed the underground, still marks portions of the subgrade level as occupied. Not all of it. The closure was real in some blocks, but the map does not show a uniformly sealed underground. It shows a corridor that was officially closed in the public health record, and still present, still marked, still categorized as active space in the insurance survey that the city's own fire underwriters were using to set coverage rates. The city closed the underground on paper. The insurance maps did not get the message. If this investigation is landing differently than you expected, subscribe. The next one follows a different kind of sealed record, in a different city, where what was closed officially and what was closed actually are not the same document. Now, consider what the underground was actually used for in the years between the regrading and the 1907 ordinance. The lower corridors were not a curiosity. They were connected to utility lines routed through the subgrade level because rerouting them above grade would have required excavating the newly finished streets. They were connected to the basements of the buildings above them, which meant they were accessible from private property without requiring entry from the public street. And they ran beneath blocks that by the early 1900s had become the commercial and social center of a city that had grown from the 3,500 residents of 1880 to more than 80,000 by 1900. Archival patterns suggest the lower corridors were used, in the years of their official ambiguity, for purposes that the public health ordinance was partly designed to address and partly designed to provide cover for closing without specifying. The record is silent on the full inventory of what operated below First Avenue between 1893 and 1907. What it is not silent on is the gap between the official closure date and the insurance map that followed it. That gap, 5 years, several city blocks, a Sanborn notation that did not update to reflect the ordinance, is not an administrative error. The archive knew what was down there. It simply decided not to say. Seattle is not the only American city with a sealed lower level. Chicago has its freight tunnels, 40 miles of narrow-gauge railroad running beneath the loop, decommissioned in 1959, still present. Portland has the Shanghai tunnels, whose documented history is thinner than the legend built around them. Cincinnati has its unfinished subway, poured concrete and steel sitting untouched beneath the streets since 1927. Every major American city that rebuilt aggressively in the late 19th century left something below the grade it built up to. This seems what makes Seattle's underground specific. What separates it from the others as a documentary case is the precision of the gap between the official record and the insurance record. Most sealed infrastructure simply stops generating documentation. The Seattle Underground generated 2 simultaneous and contradictory paper trails for at least 5 years. One trail said it was closed. The other trail said it was still there, still occupied, still worth insuring against fire. D. The underground tour that operates in Pioneer Square today has run continuously since 1965. It takes visitors through portions of the original sub-grade corridors, the brick archways, the ghost storefronts, the sidewalk skylights that once let light filter down from the street above. The tour is well documented, historically grounded, and genuinely useful as an introduction to the regrading story. What it does not cover, what no official account of Seattle's underground fully addresses, is the 5-year window between the closure ordinance and the insurance map that ignored it. The question the record leaves open is not what the underground was. The physical space is documented. The engineering is understood. The question is narrower than that, and sharper. Who decided what the map would say, and what it wouldn't?